Hello and welcome back. Today we are looking at Chapter 12, Section 2, Jackson in the White House. Yesterday and the day before in our lesson and then in our quiz, we talked about how Jackson was elected and that his presidency was kind of a bit of a turning point in American history, because before that all of the leaders had been almost like aristocratic, whereas Jackson, he had been born on the frontier and had this prided himself as being a man of the people. But so today we're going to look at the man Jackson, and a little bit about his own personal history and who he was growing up and how that translated into the White House. Now, so our essential question for today is, what made Andrew Jackson successful as a president? So we're going to be looking at some of the different policies as well that he put in place, and some of the things like that. And as you can see, I've also done an audio recording for today, so if you would prefer to use that, you can just hit stop on this video and continue on with the audio recordings. Otherwise, let's get into our key terms. And as you can see, our key terms for today, we only have two of them. It's spoil system and kitchen cabinet. And this particular kitchen cabinet is not the same one that you will find in your own house, but we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. So to start out, I have a question for you. What is democracy? Is it a way of life? Is it a way of governing? And specifically for today's discussion, what should the president's role be in a democracy? So in America, we've talked about this a few different times, but just as a refresher, our government is a blend of democracy and republicanism, and in which people have a say in government, but we elect representatives to speak on our behalf. It's a representative democracy. Now, do you think that our nation should be more democratic? So as we go through today's lesson, I want you to keep this idea of democracy in the back of your minds. Kind of take that and put that back there in the sticky part of your brain and just kind of think about it a little bit. As we study the presidency of Andrew Jackson, I want you to look at his actions and evaluate them as he tried his best to make the country more democratic. And was he truly a man of the people, as many people believed, and as he believed himself? Evaluate his actions as he tried to make the country more democratic, and think to yourself, was he really a man of the people, like he believed and like many other people believed? So these two questions, just get them back there in the sticky part of your brain and think about them a little bit as we go through today's lesson. And here he is, the man, the myth, the legend, Andrew Jackson. Now, Jackson appealed to a large part of the country, mainly because of his upbringing. I mentioned he had been born on the frontier in a log cabin to Irish immigrant parents. He was a strong fighter, and he had this natural toughness that saw him through a lot of battles as he was through his military career. And at the ripe old age of 13, he joined the Patriots in the American Revolution, but was captured by the British. Now, most of you are around that age, so can you imagine, first, joining a war, and second, being captured by the enemy? There's a story told about him from the Revolution that after he had been captured by the British, he was ordered to clean a British officer's boots. And when he refused, the officer took out his sword and slashed Jackson through his arm. He raised his arm to protect him, but the sword cut down almost all the way to the bone. And it was this incident that kind of solidified this hatred that he had for the British that was going to affect Jackson for the rest of his life. And he eventually got his revenge on the British during the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, but he still, from the age of 13 on, had this hatred for the British that just was undying. And after the war, he studied law in North Carolina and later set up a pretty successful law practice in Tennessee. And though he had been born poor, he ended up becoming very wealthy from selling land in Georgia and Alabama, and was elected to Congress while he was still in his 20s. So in not a lot of time, Jackson did a lot of stuff. And I mentioned the Battle of New Orleans, and that propelled him to becoming a national hero, even though the battle took place a few weeks after the war was over. Nobody in the country cared because it was such a huge victory for the Americans. And he also became famous for fighting the Creek Indians and forcing them to give up the mountains and their homelands in Georgia and Alabama, which he ended up selling and using that money to become very wealthy. So the guy really did a lot. So just from these things that he was able to accomplish in his life, we see that Jackson was a very complex man with many talents. He was intelligent but had a very violent temper. He could inspire and lead others, but he dealt very harshly with his critics and with his enemies. He was seen as being a man of his word and a man of his people, but to the Creek Indians, he was a ruthless enemy that showed no mercy. And after defeating them in 1812, Jackson threatened to kill all of their leaders if they did not give up the lands guaranteed them by earlier treaties. And his threats of violence and ruthlessness on the battlefield earned him the nickname Shark Knife from the Creeks. So he was a pretty bad dude. And this next video is going to go into a little bit more detail about Jackson's early life and how his upbringing affected the way he dealt with others, and we're going to look at how that's going to then affect the way that he approaches the presidency.
Democrat or demagogue, Jackson profoundly changed the nature of the presidency and established new political and economic traditions for the nation. The hardships of Jackson's early life made him see every event as a struggle for survival. Born in the backwoods of South Carolina, he was the son of Scotch-Irish immigrants. His father died before Andrew was born, and both his brothers died in the Revolutionary War. 13-year-old Jackson was taken prisoner by the British and received a saber slash on his face for refusing to polish the boots of a redcoat officer.
He scorned to brush oppression's boots when once a captive low, but lived with his tough hickory limbs to sweep the daring foe. This bold and tough old hickory, the hero of Orleans.
In 1781, his mother went to Charleston to nurse the sick and wounded of the Revolution and died of typhus, leaving Jackson an orphan at age 14. Having to make his own way in the world, he took up the study of law in South Carolina, but often spent more time gaming and carousing than with his studies. Hearing of greater opportunity in the West, Jackson and a fellow student, John McNary, headed for Tennessee, where McNary had arranged for employment in a law office. Through McNary, Jackson got a job as a prosecuting attorney and soon built a reputation for toughness as a debt collector. They took up lodgings at the boarding house of the wealthy widow Donaldson. There, Jackson courted the widow's daughter, Rachel, and sought out useful friends who would later become political allies. A shy and religious woman, Rachel shunned involvement in politics, but proved to be a devoted wife to Jackson, as well as a financial asset.
So by 1828, Jackson knew that the American people wanted a change. This is the presidential poster from 2008, but this is not the first time that people in America were calling for change, especially from the presidency. Jackson had ambitions to be a very strong president who would rework the federal government to expand the powers of the presidency and give people the reform that they desired. He believed that it was his own personal duty as the president to change the country and to do it himself. And he really prided himself on being a man of the people, but the question that we ask now is, a man of what people? So soon after he took office, Jackson fired over 200 government employees and replaced them with his own supporters. Now, most of the other presidents had done similar things, but had done so on a much smaller scale. If you remember, back when Thomas Jefferson was elected, he actually kept a lot of the Federalists in place and kept a lot of their programs running. Well, Jackson was like, you aren't on my side, you're out of here. And he was accused of rewarding his supporters instead of choosing qualified leaders. But he responded by saying that he was making the government more accessible to the common man. He believed that ordinary Americans could fill government positions just as easily as well-educated aristocrats. And a critic put it another way, and he stated that to the victor belong the spoils, and spoils are profits or benefits. So from this time forward, the practice of rewarding supporters with government jobs became known as the spoils system, one of whom we're looking at right now, Secretary of State Martin Van Buren. So to the victor go the spoils, or in this case, the victor becomes the face on the $20 bill. So Jackson rewarded a number of his supporters with cabinet jobs, but few of them were actually qualified for those positions. The only one that was really qualified, we just talked about 3 seconds ago, was Secretary of State Martin Van Buren. There he is. So because of this lack of qualification, Jackson only met with his cabinet very sparingly, very, very rarely, but he kept a group of unofficial advisors that became known as the Kitchen Cabinet. Why were they called the Kitchen Cabinet? Well, because they actually met in the White House kitchen, which we're looking at right now. So how would that make you feel as a citizen of the United States to know that the president made most of his policies in the White House kitchen rather than with the appointed officials? Personally, I'm a little skeptical about that. There have been theories of secret underground societies that actually run the country, but this is an example of a small group of unelected officials that would meet in the kitchen of the White House and discuss the policies of the country, or a small underground society that would really kind of chart the direction of the country. Did they actually have the power to make and to change policies? Well, that's debatable. But what we do know is that Jackson met with these unofficials and discussed policies much more than he met with his officials.
In the 1828 election, by avoiding a stand on major issues, Jackson was able to win the support of many different interest groups throughout the country. To the new laboring classes in the East, he appeared to be an advocate of the working man. To small capitalists, he represented an opportunity to compete with big capitalists. Southerners identified with him as a plantation owner, while Westerners saw him as their own frontier hero. Jackson also appealed to the new nationalism that was sweeping America. As a self-made man who had built the Hermitage from a shack into a mansion, as a military leader who defended the people against Indians and Englishmen, and as a man who, born in a log cabin, could be a champion of the people as President of the United States. Faithful to his friends and suspicious of rivals, Jackson began to hand out political appointments as soon as he took office. Office holders from the previous administration were replaced by loyal party workers in what has come to be known as the spoils system. While Jackson did not invent the idea of political patronage, it had been used on the state level for many years, Jackson did introduce the practice in the national government. Previous cabinets had included nonpartisan experts in their fields. Jackson made his cabinet appointments with seeming disregard for background or experience, the main requirement being personal loyalty to Jackson. Members of the press were included in the cabinet for the first time. Amos Kendall, editor of the Kentucky Argus, was made Postmaster General. And another new tradition was established. Jackson surrounded himself with a group of non-elected, unofficial, but influential advisors who came to be known as the Kitchen Cabinet. Howls of disapproval were voiced in the opposition press, with Jackson depicted as the evil manipulator of a set of greedy puppets. In actuality, however, the new president replaced only about 9% of all civil servants, no more than Jefferson had done before him. Jackson called this policy rotation in office and saw it as a means of weeding out corruption. While his enemies made fun of rats deserting a toppling house, Jackson was glad to get rid of undesirables, as frauds and misuse of public funds to the amount of $280,000 were uncovered in the Treasury Department alone. When Jackson took office, sectional interests divided the country. New England was symbolized by a turtle because it surrounded itself by the shell of high tariffs, and the West was seen as a tough-skinned alligator, ready to swallow up anything in sight. But Jackson saw himself as the only person elected by the whole nation, and maintained that it was his duty to represent all interests equally.
Which brings us to the Bank of the United States. Yes, we really are talking about this again. Jackson was not a fan of the bank, so he decided to wage his own personal war on the Bank of the United States because, like most average Americans at that time, he felt that the bank was just way too powerful. And we've talked about the bank before. It had been a subject of debate and dispute ever since it had been founded. And the bank, as a refresher, controlled the loans made by state banks, and when the Bank of the United States directors felt that the states were making too many loans, the bank would limit the amount that those banks could lend. And these cuts angered farmers and business owners who needed this money to buy land or to finance new businesses. In steps Jackson, and Jackson saw the bank as a many-headed monster that, as the president, it was his responsibility to slay. Because, like I said, Jackson wanted to make the presidency more powerful, and he felt that it was his responsibility to make the presidency more powerful and to make the country more democratic. And the thing to remember about Jackson, if you remember nothing else about President Jackson, is that everything with him was personal. And if you crossed him, everything was a personal vendetta. So Jackson and other Democrats saw the bank as being undemocratic because it basically put private bankers in charge of the country's money system. So Jackson condemned the men that were in charge for getting rich off of public funds, and specifically, he resented the president of the bank, Mr. Nicholas Biddle, because he saw Biddle as being arrogant and having influence over Congress. So, A, Jackson didn't agree with the bank on a fundamental level, and B, he was taking out his frustrations with Biddle. It was business and it was personal. And here he is, Mr. Nicholas Biddle, president of the bank. So Biddle and his Whig supporters in Congress were afraid that Jackson would get rid of the bank, so they devised a plan to save the bank and try and ruin Jackson at the same time. They thought that most Americans actually supported the bank, so they made the bank an issue in the upcoming election. And they believed that if they did so, then Jackson would lose and the bank would be safe. So a bill to renew the charter of the bank was pushed through Congress while Jackson was actually at home sick in bed. And again, Jackson took this as a personal attack. So when the bill came to him to be signed into law, Jackson vetoed it. He declared the bank unconstitutional, even though the Supreme Court had ruled in favor of the bank, and the Supreme Court is the branch of government that has the power to declare things constitutional or unconstitutional. So Jackson declared that it was unconstitutional and felt the bank only helped the wealthy at the expense of the common man. And as for the bank issue destroying Jackson in the upcoming election, as we can see from this map, he ended up winning by a landslide. 77% of the electoral vote and well over half of the popular vote. So the common people had surprised the Whigs by supporting Jackson and rejecting the Bank of the United States. So Jackson saw this not only as a victory for his party, but as a personal victory against people that he felt didn't appreciate him. And since Jackson had vetoed the bill to renew the charter for the bank, and since he'd also been reelected and won the presidency again, there really was no hope for the bank to remain open. The bank was under its charter was scheduled to close in 1836, but that wasn't soon enough for Jackson. He forced the Secretary of the Treasury, Roger Taney, to stop depositing federal money into the bank and instead deposit it into state banks. And the state banks were actually controlled by Taney and a few of his associates. So once again, the majority of the nation's money was under the control of a few men. But wasn't that what Jackson was trying to get rid of? Without federal income, the Bank of the United States closed in 1836, when it was scheduled to close, and its closing helped contribute to an economic crisis.
In his first term in office, Jackson has shown that he is quite willing to use federal power against rebellious states and against the tribes. But on economic issues, he takes a different stance.
In 1832, Jackson was up for re-election, and Henry Clay thought he could defeat him if he only had a really strong issue. The most attractive issue to Clay was the question of the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States was a huge financial institution for the time. It was the only bank chartered by the federal government, but it wasn't just a branch of the government like the Federal Reserve System is today. It also operated as a private bank with primary responsibilities to make a profit for its shareholders. Well, the bank had been chartered in 1816 for 20 years, which meant that its charter would expire in 1836. The Friends of the Bank, which were basically included Northeastern, merchants, and other bankers, wanted the bank's charter to be renewed. Of course, there was no absolute burning reason to agitate this issue in 1832. That was a little bit early. But Clay figured that if Congress and the President refused to renew the charter, then Clay could use that as an issue for running against the President. Clay, of course, never quite got the hang of this populistic kind of politics. What he forgot was that for every banker, there was 1,000 people who had a reason to dislike the bankers.
The bill to renew the charter of the Bank of the United States passes Congress and lands on Andrew Jackson's desk on the 4th of July, 1832, just as the political campaign for his re-election is heating up.
Jackson took a week to think about it and composed a blistering veto, which no one expected him to write, in which he denounced the Bank of the United States as an engine of aristocracy. He said that the bank was mostly owned by British aristocrats and that it was being used to control the American economy and enslave the average American farmer by manipulating prices, by manipulating the value of paper money, and by interfering with the election of the people whom the average American wanted to elect, namely Andrew Jackson.
Distinctions in society will always exist under every just government. Equality of talents, of education, or of wealth cannot be produced by human institutions. But when the laws undertake to add to these natural and just advantages artificial distinctions, to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers, who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. There are no necessary evils in government. Its evils exist only in its abuses. If it would confine itself to equal protection, and as heaven does its rains, shower its favors alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. In the act before me, there seems to be a wide and unnecessary departure from these just principles.
The national elite were appalled and horrified that the President of the United States would be stirring up vulgar popular passions with this kind of class warfare rhetoric. But Jackson did it, and he did it with magnificent success, and won the election of 1832 with a greater percentage of the vote than he'd won it the first time.
Which brings us to everybody's favorite part of the day, our assignment. So, for today's assignment, I'm going to I have a couple questions I want you to think about. First off, what do you think of the spoils system? Do you think it's a good idea to reward your supporters, or should you try and keep people in their jobs that are experienced, or I don't know. It's up to you. President Jackson believed that ordinary Americans could fill government jobs just as easily as well-educated, wealthy aristocrats. So, in a couple of paragraphs, I want you to take some time and evaluate Jackson's presidency and tell me whether you think that he was truly a man of the people. Some would argue that because of his upbringing and by giving government positions to common people that, yes, Jackson was truly a man of the people. But others would argue that since he basically ran the country from the White House kitchen with a group of unofficial advisors, and also that he treated political rivals as personal enemies, that no, Jackson was not a man of the people. He was a man of the person, a man of himself. So whatever side that you take, I want you to support your statement with details from the lesson or from the text or outside sources that you have found. So this is going to be out of 10 possible points, with 20% of the grade being on mechanics. So make sure you pay attention to capitalization, usage, punctuation, spelling, those things, because those are going to factor into your grade. But with all that being said, I'm looking forward to reading what you write about whether or not you believe Jackson was truly a man of the people or he was a man of the person. The choice is up to you. All right? Good luck.